Welcome and thank you for attending this session on funder collaborations. Before we welcome our amazing panelists, I just wanted to share a bit of context and background to help frame our time together. And by way of introduction, my name is Alistair Malillan. I work at Common Council Foundation based in Oakland, California, which provides philanthropic support and services to small staff foundation and individual donors. And we also host a few pooled funding collaboratives. And I share that to say that as a relatively small staffed found organization ourselves, we actually really rely on different types of funder collaboratives, both formal and informal, to really help us create greater impact and depth in our work. And I'll say for a number of our clients, they are engaging in funder collaboratives in the way that we would define throughout this session, but they might genuinely be shocked to hear that because they think of funder collaboratives exclusively as a formal full pooled funding collaborative model. But through this session, we really hope that you get the chance to see that funder collaboratives come in many shapes and sizes, and there's no one right way to do collaboration, but is really based on what is right for your foundation. However, in general, funding collaboration really works towards either exchanging information and best practices, leveraging limited grant-making dollars, and learning about what is happening outside the walls of your foundation. So just to give a few data points, there are different funder collaborations, both formal and informal, that we wanted to offer. The first is learning networks, where the main purpose is shared learning. Funders coming together around a specific area or issue or geography to share information, to get educated on a topic, and to explore grant strategies. This often includes bringing in field experts to share current information with folks in the network. The second is strategic alignment of grant making, where the main purpose is coordinated funding by a group of funders to specific issue areas or geographies. In this type, participating funders conduct complementary grant making with other aligned funders who fund in a specific area or geography. But the key point is that the grant making activity still happens within the walls of their own foundation. The next is pooled funding collaboratives, where grant making dollars are collected and housed by one organization that administers all the grant awards instead of those awards coming separately from several foundations. Depending on the scale, this type of funder collaboration can have staff or no staff, has formal voting structures for grant making decisions that might be different than your own foundation, and often has learning opportunities for participating funders. The last and most common and most informal type is simply having conversations with other funders, talking grant strategies and grant partners with other foundation peers who fund in similar areas to gather information on potential grant partners, best practices, and field updates. So I think that's enough background information to get started in this conversation. So I wanted to shift gears and invite our amazing panelists into the space. We have Hez Norton of Laughing Gull Foundation, Molly Schultz-Hafid of Butler Family Fund, and Holly Bartling of General Service Foundation. So I want to invite each panelist to take a few minutes to introduce yourself, your organization, and your organization's funding initiatives and funding collaboratives. Hez, would you like to get us started?
Great. Thanks, Alistair, and thanks for the invitation. My name is Hez Norton, and I'm with the Laughing Gull Foundation. We're a progressive family foundation that's rooted in the South and based in North Carolina. Our three areas of funding are higher education and prison, LGBTQ equality work in the South, and finally, climate and environmental justice. We're a foundation that has high values around learning, around sharing stories, as well as around connecting with grantee partners and being in as authentic relationships one can be in funder and grantee partner relationships. And we're also a foundation that prioritizes racial equity lens in all of our work from operations and grant making and investing. Our collaboratives, I'll speak primarily to the pooled funds. We're involved in 4 different pooled funds that are specifically opportunities for us to also engage in the grant making decision process. And we're involved in 4 other collaborative funds where we have no involvement in the grant making decision process. We have some involvement in the learning, but no involvement in the decision making. One of the collaboratives that we're most involved with is called Out in the South. That initiative is one that we were part of starting several years ago and is focused on organizing and moving more resources to LGBTQ work in the South and organizing work in the South. The others that we're involved in, actually, pause on that for a second. I would say, because part of your question, Alistair, is really why we're involved in these, right? And so the 4 that we're involved in, we definitely have a lot of opportunities for co-learning, but also definite opportunities with the 4 that we're not involved in decision-making is really ceding the power of decision-making as a grant maker. And that's something that's really important to the family in this process and the staff in this process, to participate in collaboratives where we might be involved in the co-learning together, but we're involved in shared decision-making and or moving that decision-making fully to a body of activists and organizers and folks who are doing the work on the ground. The other reason is just for our own staff learning and professional development. We are a small staff of 4, and so with the amount of grantees that we're in relationship with, as well as the amount of kind of professional kind of intermediary associations we're connected to, we find that collaborative is, and being in the experience of grant making together, is a key way to learn. The other reason why we're involved in collaboratives is that the foundation does have a strategic goal of moving more resources to the issues that we care about the most. And we find that being in relationship and being in collaboratives is an opportunity for us to share our learning and really the learning of the grantees and what they've shared with us, as well as learning from others about what they're seeing related to the issue areas in the fields, as well as finally our reason is just, you know, increasing our impact and increasing the reach of our dollars as we find different organizations or different ways of thinking about the work that we might not have known about before. So those, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Hez. Molly, could I have you invite you into the space?
Sure. Hello. Thank you, Alistair, again for putting together this panel, and to Holly and Hez for your what I know are going to be wonderful and thoughtful comments. I am Molly Schulze-Feed. I'm the executive director of the Butler Family Fund. We're also a small, leanly staffed family foundation. Our mission is to seek lasting solutions to homelessness and an equitable criminal legal system. In particular, our core strategy is to fund community-led organizations with an emphasis on campaigns that are seeking to divest funding from the criminal legal system and invest it into housing, education, healthcare, and other essentials for healthy, safe, and strong communities. We're actually a part of, currently we're a part of 3 different collaborative funds, and I serve as the chair of a platform that helps funders collaborate. And ours are also a mix of different types of funding vehicles to coordinate funding. So the 8th Amendment Project is an effort coordinated largely by groups that are actually doing work to end the death penalty. And then the executive director of many of the different, who works with many of the different organizations, also organizes a collaborative of funders to do funder education and grant making. We're not formally a member of it, but it's a great model where we talk with the executive director after each round and find out where could our limited resources fill in some gaps. So there's a core of funders that are really a part of the grant making together. And then we're sort of, I like to think of it as like the putty in between. So if there's 25,000 that could be really great here, or 13,000 that would finish out this, Butler has long been in partnership with the 8th Amendment Project to really work in an area where we don't have a robust grant making program around death penalty abolition, but it's been a core commitment of the family since the foundation was started. So it's been a really great way to be able to know our dollars are in coordination with other funders who have more resources, but can also really make a difference in a very real way for a set number of organizations in an issue where we just don't have a large amount of funding. So I think that's been an incredibly effective model for Butler Family Fund. The second is something called the Youth First State Advocacy Fund. And it's a pooled fund that was set up sort of alongside a community-led and movement-led fund that has to do with state campaigns that are working to help end youth prisons. And our funding in that case, my colleague sits on a pooled funding group that makes decisions all together. And that pooled fund works in close partnership then with a set of campaigns. I think I don't want to get it wrong, but in multiple states. And the campaigns do the work to develop what they're going to be doing. And then they coordinate with the pooled fund to think about what kind of resources will be most helpful. And I like that one as well for Butler because, again, the leadership around the work and what needs to be happening on the ground remains with movement leaders. And the funder conversation is focused on learning so that we can know what's happening in the field, but then also resourcing plans that have been directly developed by movement-based organizations. We also contribute to the Southern Power Fund, which is a wonderful initiative that we have no decision-making stake or authority in, and we're delighted by that. It's a wonderful and beautiful fund that I believe exceeded their goal last year of raising $10 million. They might have raised $12 million, and it was distributed throughout the South to over 225 groups on the front line through 2 rounds of general grant making and 3 rounds of rapid response. And all of those decisions were made directly by community-based leaders in the South. And our money was really able to be a part of a much larger pool that could get little bits to groups that just needed a little and larger bits to groups that needed a larger amount. And to cut through a lot of the red tape, the fund had a commitment to use trust-based philanthropy and not require all the hoops that traditional funders do. So in our case, it was also an opportunity to really lower any burdensome thresholds for even just a basic inquiry and the need for funds, and really allow movement-based folks who could do some of that research and vetting based on what they knew about their communities and different leaders. So I think each of those are really different models of pooled funds and collaboratives that Butler has invested in, and we're really excited about. And the final thing is I'm also the chair of the board for something called Just Fund, which is a platform, a nonprofit grants management platform that hosts collaborative funds and connects funders and organizers for values-aligned, trust-based, and equity-rooted grant making. So it's a tool where funders, and we can talk about this more later in the panel, where if you really just don't have the resources to be a part of a collaborative, you can still use a collaborative mindset and go into this particular portal and find things that other funders you know have supported, and think about ways where your money can really be connected to a larger community of funders, and you can benefit from using what do you call that, a shared application. So you don't have to add the extra burden to grantees, which is really one of the purposes of that particular portal. So those are just a few of the different ways in which the Butler Family Fund really wants to support collaboratives. And I would add to Hez's list, I know limited staff capacity, learning from experienced funders, leveraging, those are all the reasons we're a part of it. And I would just add one last one to that emerging list, which is to explore funding in new areas. So, you know, this goes to a different funder I worked with, but a few foundations ago, we didn't really have a robust portfolio in LGBTQ grant making. And we were able to join what at the time was the LGBTQ Racial Justice Fund. And we were able to learn lots of new grantees, and then many of them were added to our regular grant making portfolio. And it was a very low stress, low barrier, welcoming way to learn about a new field of groups and really be able to focus on finding new organizations, but not waiting until we found them. So we could put the money in the field while we were learning and not withhold it until we felt like we had the perfect group. And that was a really rich and wonderful experience. So I would just add collaboratives are also really great for getting involved in emerging fields or areas where you don't have as much experience. So I'll pause there and pass it back to Alistair.
Thanks, Molly. That's a lot of wisdom already. And Holly, could I ask or invite you to enter the space too?
Absolutely. And I echo this, the thanks for pulling us together. It's really nice to see dear colleagues and appreciate the opportunity to learn together and to share. I think there's a lot of alignment across all of us with small and mighty foundations with small staff. So I'm Holly Bartling. I'm with the General Service Foundation. I'm the Senior Program Officer, and I manage the Building Voice and Power portfolio at GSF. General Services Foundation is a family foundation, and our work funds at the intersection of racial, gender, and economic justice to bring about a more just world. At GSF, we know that it will take more than our foundation's resources to bring about the scale of change that we hope to see in the world. And I think we have collaboration built in our DNA as a result of that. So we're always looking at how to partner with our colleagues to add up to something bigger. And we really see funding collaborative funds and pooled funds as core to our strategy for that reason. So like Molly and Hez, we're in a number of collaborative funds. I think it's about 10 by my count. And we have a real range of levels of participation. So similarly, we are in some where we simply make the grant and then we trust the fund to make the decisions about where the resources go. In about 4 of them, we're very actively on the steering committee and put a lot of staff time into the collaborative funds. And that includes funds like the Partnership Fund, which funds at the intersection of civic engagement and racial justice to build a thriving and robust democracy, and funds a lot of state level work, as well as the Amplify Fund, which is supporting building community power for just and equitable development. Those are examples of foundation of pooled funds where we'll sit together as a group across kind of many different geographical and issue area differences to make decisions about grants. And I think part of why we have been participating in these collaboratives, one is to simply, I think in the same way Molly and Hez stated, to channel resources to state and local work in particular. As a staff of 4, we know that it's important to get resources to the state and local level, but it's very difficult to do that well with a small staff. And so the collaborative funds are a way to do that with skill and care and expertise and deep knowledge of the states where we're investing. We also do it for the learning. And I think for us as a funder who is funding at the intersection of many issues, sitting around the table with people that might have deep expertise in one of the issues helps us to really build out our own understanding and sharpen our intersectional analysis, even as we go deeper on with funders who are deep in racial justice or gender justice or economic justice. And I think that, for example, the Amplify Fund also has both state and national funders sitting at the table. So that kind of builds out our own understanding and helps us to see the bigger whole. It also gives us ways to expand our grant making practices. We've been really deeply exploring and building our own practice around trust-based grant making, and a number of these collaborative funds have been really experimental and I would say on the cutting edge of finding ways to be relieving burdens on grantees and being closer into the field. And I want to give a shout out to the Just Fund, because actually a number of our collaborative funds are now using the Just Fund for receiving the proposals from grantees so that funders can also see those proposals and fund them directly. So I think there's a lot of innovation happening in that space. And then the last thing I'll say is it's a leveraging opportunity for us. Sometimes our small grant might get us a seat at the table, but it helps us build relationships with a whole range of funders, including some that have a lot more resources at their disposal. And it can translate into bigger grants for some of the groups that we've been funding for a long time to give them increased support. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Holly, and appreciations for all of you for being willing to be part of this panel. So I don't want to say that funder collaboratives are all sun and roses, sunshine and rainbows. And so I want to get a little bit into the depth of this. And so could we go through a round of questions and talk about what are the struggles related to funding collaboratives? Where have funding collaboratives fallen short or and not met the needs of your foundation or your work? And so maybe for this round, Holly, I'm wondering if you might be willing to kick us off.
Sure. I think one of I think the big one that we've come across and we've navigated in different ways is how to balance resources that are at the table with expertise that sits at the table. And this happens in many ways, but sometimes the collaboratives can be structured almost like a pay to play. The more money you put in, the more decision-making authority you have. And there can be structures where if you have to give a certain minimum amount to sit on the decision-making body. Um, and I think what we've offered when we've sat at those tables is to think about what a substantial contribution might be for an institution as opposed to a flat amount. And to think about what resources people bring to the table in a very expansive way, not just the money that people might bring to the table, but relationships, knowledge of the field, and expertise. And I think navigating that, I would say it's played out in different ways in different collaborative funds, but the ones where it's been really successful is when we've been actually able to name that and to have open conversations about how decisions are made and to be explicit about what it looks like to have a shared decision-making process that is transparent and clear. When that is not the case, it can be very frustrating and power dynamics can creep up or become very openly apparent in these networks, in these collaborative funds. And I think for me, that's the struggle, is finding ways to name both the implicit structures of power as well as explicit structures that might be making it more difficult for a smaller funder to sit at the table in the same way.
Thanks, Holly. That's awesome. What do you think about this?
I would say one of the struggles can be when there's not like a base of trust and not everyone joins at the same time. And so there's often sometimes like a repeating, like, oh, this group has established a rapport and a relationship and a staff member leaves, if there's some kind of transition. And so there's a repeating. So I think that having a holder, a team that holds the whole of the relational dynamics, because the process is really important. And I think, where I have experienced, not in the current ones that we're in now, but in the past when I've experienced collaborative breakdowns, oftentimes it's around trust and something in the process. And it's a key part of a funding collaborative, as it is a key part of your staff team. It's not a staff team, but you are kind of extending this circle of way of thinking and kind of collaborating on something together that is similar, but a different relationship. So that trust and having folks that really hold the whole of those group dynamics and process. I think I've also seen the struggle of when there's not enough resources raised and trying to figure out, okay, how, like, what do we need to get to make this kind of worthy of our time and investment, and how is this really in support of grantee work? How is this really in support of the issues? And where is that line? Because oftentimes, particularly when I think if funder collaboratives aren't like very informed by the grassroots and by folks on the ground, I think funders, we can kind of spin out in like either, we could go towards like outcome and measurement language, or, like just like the things that funders do around like how smart we can feel like we should be or are, and like just being ground, like to bring it back, actually who in the room here like is actually doing this work right now and can speak to it. And I think so I think always coming back to that, like, who are we accountable to? And how are we being accountable? And how are we moving money or moving more resources or educating one another and making sure that there is an impact? And I think, to speak to, I think both Holly and Molly spoke to this piece of like the learning from the collaborations and like taking more risks. That's completely happened with Laughing Gull in our relationship with the Trans Justice Funding Project and Fund for Trans Generations, which we're on both of their collaboratives. And there's practices that we learn there about how they're doing grants. So we're like, oh, wow, like we can do this. We just learned. And so it's so we can go to a webinar and watch something about that, or like, but when you're actually in the room with like 8 other people and you're practicing something different, it's so much easier for that program officer or myself to come back to the board and say, hey, we just did this. this is awesome. Let's try a video report instead of an application. Let's try, making our application accessible in different ways, and so it's, sorry, I jumped to a positive around collaborative rather than the struggle, but I feel like it is more of a struggle when you're just reading about it or just watching a webinar. When you're in the practice, in the room with people and watching the impact, you feel it in a different way. I think that's the last challenge, translating the learnings to the board. So why are you spending all this time here? And you're going there again for another collaborative meeting. And you're spending all this time, all these grant proposals for this collaborative, and translating that learning and working with the organization, staff and board to talk about like how we learn and how we're a learning organization. And actually, we may have moved just this much money, but here's this learning that's now impacting the rest of our work. And here's this learning that's going to change our grant making process or X, Y, Z about how we do our work. And that's really important to meet the mission. And that is in support of the grantees and the issues. So always bringing it back to that.
Thanks, Hez. That was super rich. Molly, could I have you weigh in on here?
I love, I just want to say, I think there's always something to be said for how we find our way into the positive. And so I just want to acknowledge Hez that I think that I'll start there with the struggle of a funding collaborative. I thought you ended so nicely by talking about how do you translate that learning into the work that your foundation does? And one of the things I jotted down in thinking about this question was how you translate it to the board. I think you captured that so perfectly. And it's actually, to me, we tend to report to our trustees in rosy terms, but usually the lessons we learn come out of things that aren't always rosy, right? So I think to sort of sugarcoat and be like, all of these are sunshine and rainbows and look at all the great stuff. I actually think that you ended on the great stuff is the life of being a partnership minded and collaborative grant maker. Is our grant making is made better by screwing up sometimes and learning from it, right? And what a collaborative does in some ways is actually help to insulate and mitigate the level of harm that does to the field, because you're with a group of other people who can say, whoa, slow your roll, that's not gonna cut it, I don't know. So the idea in the best of those situations, we're really genuinely learning from our partners and allowed space to reflect on our grant making in ways that philanthropy is so isolating, and particularly for those of us in leanly staffed foundations. I have one other colleague, she's lovely, but it's just the two of us. So, trying to think about hearing from a broader range of colleagues is a real gift in being able to bring insight for both of us, to bring insight back to the organization. So thinking about how to translate that up to the board, I would just add one of the lessons to learn is also then thinking about sharing not just the rosy picture, but how we got there might be one way to handle that. And then the other area, to go a different direction, I'd say that what I've experienced in collaboratives is also that they've all struggled at some point with broad versus deep. And so I think that you can have a collaborative that starts with, we want to invite everybody in who's interested in this big thing. And then you end up with experts next to real beginners. And there's some that can be really dynamic for both sides of that equation. And in other cases, you might end up with, you've got just your choir and you guys are going to go really, really deep. And you don't then leverage and invite in other funders. And I would say I've been through collaboratives that actually have existed as both. So they might have started really narrow and then found a way to broaden so that they could invite more funders in, or started really broad and gone down. And so I think it's helpful to really think about how long has the collaborative existed? Where are they in their life cycle? Are you really at the starting phase? And when you look around the table, is it all your friends? Or are there a bunch of people you don't know? And really then making sure you create space for developing the trust and some shared political analysis, because oftentimes it plays out around the bureaucracy of a collaborative. So it plays out when we're talking about, do we give this group 75 and this group 25? But that's actually that has to do with different understandings of, do we trust this group because it has a white guy as the ED, and we don't trust this group because it's all volunteer BIPOC leaders. And so the way that that lack of a shared racial justice analysis can play out is by having really disparate outcomes in how you make decisions as a group. And so I think in any collaborative, being really attentive to how we develop some shared understanding without always going down to the lowest common denominator, but really trying to elevate our work together so that we can really achieve more significant and equity grounded outcomes. So I'll pause there.
I think that's a perfect segue into the next question. And now we're kind of closing out as we're just opening up this discussion for folks. But the next round of question, and I guess the closing round, is really, what do you wish you knew before engaging in funder collaboratives? And what advice would you give to folks exploring what funder collaboratives make sense for them? And particularly for folks who are just beginning to explore funder collaboratives or funder collaboration in any of the ways that we've defined, what do you wish that they would know? And so Molly, I'm wondering if I could start with you this round.
Sure. So I'm going to start with your second question and then back into the first one, which is, I think that you can use a collaborative mindset as an institution, even if you aren't in collaboratives. And so some of the ways that that can work is to find your funder friends and connect with them and share your grant making lists and talk about where you have overlap, and think about maybe there's ways in which you can streamline your own processes by timing your grants so that you can look at what other funders or what other collaboratives are funding, and then think about how to build off of that, particularly those of us that have more leanly staffed foundations. So I think that we can use a collaborative mindset. It's one of our Achilles heels as a sector is the ego of having to find your thing. And I would encourage my fellow leanly staffed foundations that our thing should be finding each other, because we can do more together, because we don't have a lot of capacity, and collaboratives are a great way to do that, and collaborating with one another is a really great way to do that. So I would just throw that encouragement out there. I would also, at the risk of it sounding too much like a pitch, I mean, I would look at something like a Common Council that already houses collaboratives and think about, is there something that they're funding that would appeal to your board? Or look at something like a Just Fund and think about, are there groups on there where you can streamline your own procedures by building off of the work of others and really benefiting from the due diligence, whether you know them or not. Somebody's already vetted it, and if it's been vetted, then you can fund it. So there are ways that we can try to be more, think of our work as part of the commons as a sector, rather than it having to be the discrete ownership of our institutions. So I think you should sort of jump in there. I haven't met that many people that are like, no, I don't really want to talk to you about my grants. They're like, yeah, I want to tell you what I'm making grants to. So ask, right? It's a great thing. And then the last thing I would say about funder collaboratives is be wary of grand expectations. So in my experience, particularly in the early stages, if you're joining a new collaborative, or you've really taken what I just said to heart and you found 10 friends and you want to start funding some stuff together, remember that when you're meeting, you have like 1/10 of 10 people's time, which barely equals one person's time, which means that like nothing's going to move as fast or smoothly as you want it to. So just like bring some grace to it, and know that like actually the task of herding cats is something that that is a valued one. And so investing in the actual overhead of these collaboratives. So the staff matter, and they're really helpful, and they're really talented. And when you can find somebody who can actually get everybody in a room and help facilitate a good conversation and provide the resources needed for everybody to walk away feeling like they've been able to make a set of grants that matter, that's an incredible gift. To do that across 10 colleagues and 10 institutions and 10 theory of change and 10 norms, when you find those people, and I'll just give a shout out, like Alistair, those are unicorns in our sector. So being able to really think about how we support the infrastructure needed to collaborate well, it's a place where our dollars really have a multiplier effect. And so to be patient and thoughtful and really invest in the support that you'll need to be successful if you find yourself in that kind of early stage of your collaborative work. So I'll pause there and pass it back to Alistair. I hope I didn't embarrass you too much, but
Thanks, Molly. Holly, I'm wondering what advice you might have for folks.
Um, sure. I would say for those who have not joined a funder collaborative, start small. And I think there are a lot of ways to do that. The Amplify Fund, for example, is now, they created a kind of an on-ramp for learning. So you can be a learning member and not be a formal steering committee member. And that's a way to get to know the grantees, get to know the other funders, get to know the work before kind of being all in. And I think it's a really great model for folks that aren't sure whether they want to do it, to just get in and start building relationships with people and start learning. The other thing I would say is you think about the collaborative funds as an opportunity to explore your growth edges and to practice a kind of philanthropy that you want to see, including maybe what you can't do at your own institution. So I've seen folks come to some of the collaborative funds from institutions that maybe don't have as explicit a commitment to racial justice, but they personally are deeply committed. And they consider the collaborative funds in a way where they're experiencing what it's like to have that explicit lens and to do that work directly. I think similarly around grant making practice, it's a good place for, as we've talked about before, a place to kind of experiment with and explore new ways of working together. So to me, like the part of the beauty of the collaboratives is this place of figuring out, where do I want to grow, and can I sit in a place where I'm practicing the kind of philanthropy that I want to see in the world, and then finding ways to translate that back to my own home institution. And then I guess the point I would make about what I wish I knew before engaging in funding collaboratives, or what I guess I'll share after this last stretch, is it takes a lot of staff time. So, I mean, the idea that you're doing it to move money as a small team is right. And several of the collaboratives that we've been part of have gone through really big strategic visioning processes in this past year and a half, as they should, as conditions change. And so even what we thought our initial commitment was has grown. And I think finding ways to kind of do a gut check to see how much time can I commit, and then can I be in dialogue to say I need to step back more now, or I can step up, I think is really important. And then I'll also just share, they can take a lot of staff time, but we found that to be some of the best use of our staff time. So there's this tension there where you're spending a lot of time on this work, but it's also bringing a lot of really great new information and strategy and grant ideas and practices back into our institutions.
Thanks, Holly. That's awesome. Hez, I'm wondering, could you offer some advice for folks?
Yeah, well, so much appreciation for Molly and Holly, and just resonate with so much of what you said. I think one thing I'll share is just that I tried to start some kind of collaborative with the higher education and prison program. And so I was kind of for like a year and a half in a role of trying to find the funders and gather them, and it just wasn't working. There wasn't enough there. There's not a ton of funders in that field. So after like 6 to 8 months of kind of trying to organize something and not working, I kind of stepped back and said, okay, what's a different way here, right? And so my different way in the intermediate time period was just really just connecting one-to-one with a lot of funders over a year's time period, who might have criminal justice reform on their frame somewhere, but not higher ed and prison, and to just develop relationships and learn more about their thinking of funding in the criminal justice reform, and also share higher education and prison. So there's still not a collaborative, but there's like a loose network of folks that sometimes we talk, 4 or 5 of us, and sometimes 10 might show up. At some point, I'm hoping for it to be a collaborative that has some kind of focus on higher ed and prison, but for now, it's been a great way for us to learn from each other and connect about how we fund and why we fund these issues. And so just a story is like, at first I was like, wait, I'm alone, I can't find anybody. And then after doing some more of the one-to-one connections, it's not a pooled fund, it's probably going to be years away from a pooled fund. But for right now, it's just really good conversations and sharing our thinking and strategy, which has been super helpful. So that's the only thing that I would add to everything that Holly and Molly shared, which also just completely resonate for me. So that's it.
And on note, I'm taking a lot of copious notes on my end on wisdom from you all. And we're quickly coming up on time, but any last words from folks before we move to closing?
I always want to be the cheerleader. I mean, I love that story you told, Hez, so I just want to like underline it. I just think that again, collaboration, it's a mindset. It doesn't have to always be a structure that has a home. And so so just sort of, when in doubt, don't sit there by yourself, phone a friend, you know, and have a conversation. And you know, sometimes that turns into a collaborative, and other times it just turns into a network of relationships that allows us to add dimension and meaning to our work in a way that is counter to the prevailing culture in philanthropy, which is isolating. And so so collaboration is really one of the ways in which we can get out of our tunnel vision. And again, it can take a formal institutional form along the lines of what Alistair outlined at the beginning, but it can also just be a mindset like Hez was outlining in terms of connecting with others and just trying to build networks of support for one another that can help us move resources in ways that can be really meaningful and responsive to the field. So so I just wanted to be a cheerleader and say, go forth and do, you know, and try to be thoughtful about it. Obviously, don't, you know, stomp around in places, but look around and say, who else is out here doing this funding? And see what kinds of conversations you can have in common with them. And if it's only funders in the room, think about what it would look like to begin bringing field folks in. And because I will say that partnerships are easy among powerful equals. They get a lot harder and frankly, more meaningful, more accountable, and more relevant when we can bring in our grantees and partners from the field in ways that aren't extractive, but really can help to feed their work and provide resources they need to do the work that they've determined is most important. And there are wonderful ways to do that in the context of collaboration and partnership.
Yeah, and I might add, I love the go forth joyfully and make friends. And I'll share. I feel like we're navigating some of the most complex issues I've ever experienced trying to navigate, and trying to do it by yourself feels impossible. Even trying to do it as one institution feels really challenging. And so I think the benefit of sitting together with people from a range of perspectives is you're able to see the whole in its complexity in a much deeper way. So I feel like no one person can hold that complexity, and that's the beauty of sitting together. And then I'll just share, for us, the bright spot has just been the relationships that we've built with our colleagues, sitting around those tables, having these really big discussions about trying to tackle huge problems. And where I'll say, I think the growing edge of that work is with these collaborative funds. How do you bring in movement leaders to be part of those conversations? And the Partnership Fund, for example, is doing a really exciting experiment this round with their grants docket, where each of the state tables is going to determine their own needs and grant decisions to collectively. And I'm so excited to see those kinds of processes happening where folks on the ground are holding the power and making the decisions about where the money goes, and funders in a way are kind of just watching and learning and putting the money on the table. And I think that's a really great evolution too.
So I'll say, I think we're just at the beginning of what funder collaboratives could be for folks on the call today or folks in the session. But as a network of small staff foundations, I hope it's clear that funder collaboratives, whatever form they take, can be a super vital tool in helping extend the impact and reach of your foundation. So I just want to thank the speakers and panelists for their amazing wisdom and thoughts. And on behalf of all of us, want to thank you all as participants and viewers for taking the time to engage in this session. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference offerings. Thank you.